How come a fairly sophisticated civilization like Egypt didn't change its art for almost 3 millennia? Look at this, and now this. See a difference? Art in ancient Egypt was pretty static for centuries. Think about it. It sounds almost impossible. The Upper and Lower Egypt were unified in the 32nd century BCE for the first time by Narmer or Menes, kicking off the early dynastic era. The reunification brought with it the pantheon of proportions and representations. The ancient Egyptians treated the phenomenon of sight much differently than us. They treated images as mere symbols. The sight always provided a route to a far broader spectrum, the spectrum of ideas, and this is visible in their writing systems. Hieroglyphs took archaeologists years to decipher because of how diverse their meanings could be. Imagine mapping symbols to abstract thoughts. The Rosetta Stone, for instance, took Jean-François Champollion, a 19th century Egyptologist, 23 years to crack. Well, not crack, more like, decode. They used hieroglyphs for more stately affairs, but the rest of the writing was done in hieratic and demotic scripts. That might be misleading as to how much Egyptians wrote in their daily lives since, according to most estimates, only 1 to 5% of Egyptians could read symbolic texts. So we can ascertain that ancient Egypt was an incredibly lopsided society. The Egyptian concept of maat is crucial in this regard. Maat signified a divine order. To put it simply, it was just how things were done, the right way. It provided a structure that contrasted with the bedlam of pre-unified Egypt. In hieroglyphic writing, maat is represented by a feather, and you can see this sign often appear in relief carvings. Art was concentrated at the top of the socio-political hierarchy and was heavily tied to the status quo. It should come as no surprise that the rich politicians had developed a monopoly. Artistic expression, if you could call it that, was tied with the idea of achieving perfection in line with maat. To this end, the Old Kingdom produced the pantheon of proportions and representations, a basic guide on how best to create art. So why didn't Egyptian art evolve over time? Well, obviously there's a canon of art, so there's that. But it only covered high art. So there were changes then. Well, most artisans worked for the pharaoh and the nobility anyway, so it didn't make much difference. Since ancient Egypt was a monarchical culture, authority was absolute. So much so that the kings were considered earthly incarnations of the gods. The pharaohs were usually equated with Horus, the son of Osiris and Isis. The former pharaoh was associated with Osiris, for he was the guardian of the underworld. And since the mythological foundations of Egypt facilitated these connections, especially the idea of maat and eternal life, the socio-political structure didn't change drastically, chiefly as far as art was concerned. Yet we see that as people became wealthy in the Old Kingdom and rich people outside the royal families were allowed to commission works of art, some unique pieces appeared on the scene. However, the artistic canon had so many religious connotations that these novelties fell by the wayside. All of these ideas came together to form a system almost impossible to shake. That's a lot of different factors, so let's delve into one at a time. Here's the fundamental piece of art from the early dynastic era, the Palette of Narmer. The pharaoh Narmer can be seen imposing his will by smiting another individual. The coiling snakes on the other part of the tablet represent the unification of Egypt. But if you look closely, all the essential attributes of the artistic pantheon can be found in this tablet. There is a hierarchy of scale. The king is much larger than his contemporaries. He has conquered a people and mutilated their bodies. Their heads can be seen between their legs in a show of strength. This is the ideal image of an emperor defeating his enemies and bringing order to chaos. The gods watch on. Look at the sky goddess Hathor, who looks over the emperor, and Horus, the god of kingship, protection, and the sun, who keeps watch up close. All these ideas remain intact throughout the Old, Middle, and New Kingdoms. But wait, there's more. Take a look at how bodies are depicted. It might seem ugly and uncoordinated at first, but there's a method to the madness. The king and everybody else are represented in a paratactic pose, also known as a composite view, in which the face and the limbs are in profile, whereas the eye and torso face the viewer. Why would somebody do this? Remember how we said that art was tied to the status quo? Here's a telling example. If you want the ideal depiction of a person, you will let go of realism and focus more on the most representational aspects of their figure. Braque and Picasso. Cubism. The broad shoulders and slender legs are also shared across the board. You can see these techniques and ideas in other artworks of the era. Modern art is often articulated within the dichotomy of form and content, and you can see that both didn't change throughout ancient Egyptian history. After this piece of art from the early dynastic era, let's move on to the later ages to offer a little comparison. The early dynastic era led into the Old, Middle, and New Kingdoms, with intermediate periods sandwiched between them, culminating with the late period and the arrival of foreigners. So, there's your basic timeline of Egypt. Starting with the Old Kingdom, the first thing to know is that it's the age of wealth, abundance, and most importantly, the pyramids. By this time, the Egyptians had perfected the schematic design of the mastaba, the funerary structure with inward sloping sides. In some ways, the pyramid can be seen as the perfect manifestation of Egyptian society. The pharaoh at the top, then a handful of priests, then a bunch of average folk like merchants and artisans, and finally, a shit ton of peasants and slaves. In addition to the architecture, the Old Kingdom also witnessed a surge in sculpture. The idealism we saw in the relief carvings also starts to come through in the sculpture. Here is the iconic Khafra enthroned sculpture, and yes, it looks a bit like the Sphinx of Giza, but it also looks like many other Egyptian statues. Look at the sharp lines, the well-defined faces, and even the pose. Returning to Khafra, the statue is symmetrical and orderly, which really hones in on that concept of status quo, and the pharaoh being the harbinger of order, or maat, over chaos. This brings us to another important aspect of ancient Egyptian art: timelessness. The Egyptians believed that human life constituted 6 distinct parts: the life force, the personality, and the spirit, a combination of the previous 2, the name, the shadow, and the body. Now, we won't get into when all these ideas were introduced and how they came to be part of Egyptian law, but by the 4th dynasty, the era of our good pharaoh here, the idea of the life force, or the Ka, had found its footing. And this is a Ka statue, made to contain the life force once it had left the earthly body. Since the Egyptians believed in an afterlife, they thought the Ka could be attracted and subsequently made to reside in a statue. You cover that statue with a tomb, throw some fruits and veg so the dead pharaoh doesn't starve, build mass graves to serve him in the afterlife, et voila, you have a tomb. The ancient Egyptians were in tune with the idea of eternal life, given appropriate conditions, a big-ass tomb that is, and their art reflected that. Here's another sculpture from the 4th dynasty. You can see the idealized, timeless carving of the king. Broad shoulders, defined face, and active. Look at the left leg moving forward. The goddesses beside him are more rounded and idealized in their femininity. But about the bas-relief designs of the era? Good question, young lad. Here's an image for you. See any changes? All the qualities, the formal aesthetic ideas, and the mythological undertone were conveyed the same way in the Middle and New Kingdoms as well. The Middle Kingdom was a time of distress and upheaval, even though Mentuhotep II united Egypt again. In this tumultuous period, we see some changes in Egyptian art, but they are still too minor to diverge from the canon. Here's the oft-quoted statue of Senusret III. You can see some natural attributes coming into his face. The bearings of time seem to be taking a toll on the emperor. On top of these minor changes, the Middle Kingdom brought an influx of changes in technique, the most prominent in relief design. During the Middle Kingdom, we see the rise of sunken relief. I'm proud of that pun. Sunken relief was exactly what you'd expect it to be. Bas relief with more depth. Take a look at this. All reliefs were probably colored like this, but were bleached away by the sun or the dust. In color, you don't notice the difference. So what if we take the color away? Here you go. You can feel just how much the background has sunken. The foreground is protruded, and this was used to convey depth. In some New Kingdom carvings, you can see that one shoulder is much closer to the viewer than the other. All this is well and good, but what about the architecture? Didn't that change either? It did, but once again, not too much. The pyramids in the Old Kingdom were by far the most extensive development in Egyptian architecture. In the Middle Kingdom, we see many temples pop up, but like relief and sculpture, a blueprint was quickly established. However, in the New Kingdom, many temples added their own flourishes to the existing model. Regarding painting and sculpture, reserved chiefly for tombs and burials, we must realize that they couldn't change. They were tied with particular religious rites and established mythology. A change would have altered the religious framework of ancient Egypt. nullifying the power of the pharaohs, and they couldn't let that happen, could they? But there is one instance in Egyptian history when we see a radical departure in artistic norms, and surprise, surprise, it came with a blow to the existing religion. The 17-year rule of the 18th dynasty's Akhenaten, the heretic king, and the emergence of his Amarna style are a different flex altogether. You might have heard of his wife, Nefertiti. The rule of Akhenaten is remembered for tearing the Egyptian religion apart and introducing his own variant. I say variant, but it was more like a rejection, and you can see drastic changes in Egyptian art right away. Here you go. So, yeah. But after his death, everything reverted to default, and consequent emperors tried erasing him from history. There are, of course, other examples of divergence from the canonical style, for instance, from before the establishment of the canon. Before the early dynastic era, Egypt was a set of policies and cultures scattered across the North African landscape. The pre-dynastic era, as it is called, was a little bit all over the place, and here's where we see the most variety and experimentation in ancient Egyptian art. And so we revert to our original question: why didn't Egyptian art evolve? The answer is mainly threefold. 1. The canonical interpretation of visual symbols after the unification in the early dynastic period. 2. The rigid social structure, especially at the very top, with its ideas of divine authority and order over chaos. 3. The religious undertones that guided Egyptian civilization, which I should add, were very diverse. For example, the domestic gods of the average folk were entirely different from those of the pharaohs and the priests, since the population at large was not allowed in temples. Only in the later periods, when outsiders penetrated Egypt, did the social order receive a jolt. In the short Macedonian period, and more significantly, the Ptolemaic dynasty, we see a burst of creative energy and expression, along with novel approaches. But for those 3 millennia, whose allure and mystery rub us in all sorts of goofy ways, the artistic output remained quite stiff. We hope you liked our content. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Why did you think Egyptian art remained so static? Did we miss anything important? Let us know in the comments. That's it for now, and we'll see you in the next one.